From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the library's Center for the Book. The center is the reading promotion arm of the Library of Congress, and we promote books and reading in many ways around the country through affiliated state centers for the book, through our website, where you can see many of the programs that the Library of Congress Center has sponsored in the past, and also through the National Book Festival. This year's National Book Festival will be September the 25th. We're getting started with the planning of the programming. This will be our 10th National Book Festival, which is hard for us to believe, those of us who've been involved since the beginning. But it's a wonderful public outreach program for the library and for books in general. And I hope that if you haven't attended it, that you will come this year to join us. The Books and Beyond series is another way we promote books and reading. This is a series of programs, talks by authors of new books, and those books often or almost always have a special connection with the Library of Congress, either through the use of our collections or perhaps connection with a special project of the library. We love to show off the library and its resources, and of course, being reading promoters, we love it when the result is a book. Today's program will consist of a talk by our guest author, a question and answer period, and then a book signing session outside. The books are going to arrive outside in the foyer about 12:30, and so we can have a book signing session at the end of the program. The talk today is being filmed for later broadcast by both the Library of Congress for our website and by C-SPAN. And for that reason, I ask everyone to turn off all things electronic. I also want you to know that when you ask a question, which we hope you do, of our distinguished author whose book is getting rave reviews, I hope you all realize that. We're lucky today to have him here at the beginning of, soon after his book is out. But if you ask a question, you have become part of our broadcast, and you will be participating in the asking of your question. It gives us the permission to have you part of the broadcast if we so choose. We have an introducer for Michael. The introducer, as you might guess, is a man from the Library of Congress who knows a good deal about Thomas Jefferson. His name is Jerry Gewalt. For many years, Jerry was the manuscript specialist in the manuscript division who dealt not just with Jefferson, but with the whole early American period. Jerry retired from the library, but we won't let him go. He's back as a consultant, and he really has been the curator of the Creating the U.S. exhibit that I hope many of you have seen in the Thomas Jefferson building. It's a wonderful part of the new Library of Congress interactive experience where we tie some of our most valuable documents to electronic versions and activities that have made that exhibit hall a wonderful place for families. And families are arriving since a year ago, December, we opened a passageway from the Capitol Visitor Center right into the Library of Congress. So it's a busy place, and I hope that you will take advantage of it and the architecture of the Jefferson building. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Gerald Gewalt to introduce Michael, our speaker. Jerry?
In recent years, it's become kind of fashionable, particularly I think among liberal academics, to bash Thomas Jefferson like it's fashionable for people to be happy whenever UNC or Duke loses a basketball game. We're not going to have that experience today. Michael Kranish is a graduate of Syracuse University, another basketball team. I think they're doing pretty well this year. He lives in Silver Spring with his wife Sylvia and 2 children. He's been a reporter for decades, even though he looks kind of young. He was first a reporter for the Miami Herald and then for the Lakeland Ledger in Florida. He's been a reporter for the Boston Globe since 1984. He's been a reporter for the Globe in the Washington Bureau since 1990, and he was a White House reporter for the last 2 years of George H.W. Bush's term in office and the first 2 years of William Clinton's term in office. So, and he covered the campaign for the presidency of John Kerry, and he's the, I would say, joint author of John Kerry, the Complete Biography, which was written by several reporters for the Boston Globe. The Britain's invasion of Virginia brought together 2 American characters, one Benedict Arnold, America's favorite villain, and Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence. Surprisingly, in many of the writings about the invasion of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson comes in for more criticism than does Benedict Arnold. Thomas Jefferson's time as a wartime governor of Virginia was marked by one near disaster after another. His actions were criticized by contemporaries and mocked by his critics. Because Michael Kranish has been a close observer of modern presidents in times of crisis, I think he brings a unique perspective to Thomas Jefferson as a wartime governor, and I think it gives him an added ability to analyze Jefferson's actions. Now, this book is called Flight from Monticello, but if you think that it's just restricted to Thomas Jefferson's run from Monticello to Poplar Forest, you'd be sadly mistaken. This is really an excellent book that covers all of the period of the British invasion of Virginia, and also a lot of background on Thomas Jefferson and his abilities or inabilities as the governor. Some of you know that I can talk forever on Thomas Jefferson, but today we have a man who I think is uniquely qualified to speak about Jefferson, and so without my going on any further, I will turn over the podium to Michael Kranish.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you, Mr. Cole and Ann Bonney and the Library of Congress for having me speak here on this topic. Some years ago, an editor asked me to write a story about one of my favorite places in Washington, and that was this place, the Library of Congress. My mother and father had done research here, and I spent some time examining the library. Someone from the staff took me around to show me how it worked, and I just thought it was a magical place. There were these books in the catacombs, and they sort of levitated upwards. And then you went to the desk, and any book from the world, basically, that you wanted, you could get in about 45 minutes. And this is long before the internet, and lots of things still are not on the internet, believe it or not. So it really was a wonderful place. And then when I wrote that story, I thought how great it would be if I could one day do some research in the Jefferson Building for a book. Little did I know that I would then write a book about Thomas Jefferson, because there's libraries named after Jefferson. What new is there to say about Jefferson? It's a very legitimate question, and it's the question I asked myself as I learned about this topic. Essentially, the reason I got onto this book is I basically learned a little nugget that Benedict Arnold, the traitor, in his one major action as a traitor allied with the British, invaded Virginia when Jefferson was governor. And that got me thinking, what happened? What's the story there? How did that happen? And why did Jefferson have to flee because we think of Jefferson, obviously, authoring the Declaration of Independence, serving president his 2 years. So I thought there was a story in between there. And in fact, if you go to the White House website, the biography of Jefferson essentially skips over these years. It says he worked for years to make sure that the revolution came true in Virginia. But there is more to the story, and the clues to the story were right here at the Library of Congress. So I did a lot of my initial research at the Jefferson building and in this building in the manuscript room and other places in the Library of Congress to gather some of the initial information. So these were the years. Why is this important? Well, it's important because these were the years when Jefferson was literally tested by fire, and which helped shape the man and the president that he became. I didn't really understand at the beginning what that meant, so I wanted to know the whole story, and then I'd think about what it meant and how it shaped him. So the main thing I thought was that this is a thrilling story, a thrilling narrative that I could make into a story that not only historians would be interested, but hopefully the general reader, just on its own 2 feet, whether you are interested in the revolution or not. So I wanted to go right at the heart of what happened when Benedict Arnold invaded Virginia. Of course, when I came here, I read all of Jefferson's letters. They're collected in books, and a lot of the originals are here, and other documents are here. And that told me Jefferson's side of the story. And then I learned that there was a book called The Revolutionary War Correspondence of Benedict Arnold. So I thought, great, now I'll have Arnold's side of the story. The problem is that it ends when Arnold becomes a traitor. So the last letter you see in this book, or one of the last, is him telling the American public, join me and let's overthrow the American government. And it ends there. However, there are a lot of letters that he wrote, and so I was sitting down in the manuscript room in this building, and I found a rather obscure volume of letters that British officers wrote, and there was a letter, several letters that Arnold wrote to his superiors in which he described how he left New York with 27 ships and 1,600 men in December of 1780. And this is about 4 years after the Declaration of Independence. So a lot of people may think of 1776 as the Revolution's won. Hardly so. Jefferson's governor of Virginia. He's serving his second term. It's December of 1780. And he has no idea that Benedict Arnold, a man whom he once called a fine sailor, in fact, a man he thought would be the key to beating the British, had turned traitor just weeks earlier. And Arnold had gone to the British commander in New York and said, if we can cut off Virginia, if we can cut off supplies to the south, then we can win the war. Virginia was the most powerful state, the largest state, and yet it only had 2 brief invasions lasting only days, and the British had left. So Jefferson, as governor, thought that, well, the British come, they come for a couple of days, and they leave. Virginia hadn't had to suffer like other states, like Massachusetts or South Carolina, for example. So he thought he was rather secure. He did know, however, that if the British did come again, that Virginia was ill-prepared for an invasion. The Navy had been denuded in the previous 2 invasions. The militia were poorly armed. They were poorly fed, poorly equipped. They came out for 3-month terms, but they were concerned if they came out that their families and farms might be in danger. So it was difficult to get them to turn out for more than the term that they were supposed to turn out, for 3 months. So in theory, Jefferson thought he could rely on the militia. He did not like the idea of a strong standing army. He was concerned about it, tyranny taking over, which is why he had the revolution in the first place. So when Arnold's coming into Virginia, Jefferson's not prepared. And he prefers to think that it's just not going to happen. So right around New Year's Day of 1781, in fact, Arnold does come in, and there's a sailor with the Virginia Navy. He's on a small ship. It's called the Liberty. And he looks up and he sees these 27 ships in the bay, and he immediately goes to the shoreline and he writes a note. He's saying he saw 27 sail, and he asked someone at the shoreline to please get the message to Richmond, the capital of Virginia. And so this messenger goes, and they have 40-mile horse rides, and they change the message off and off and off. And a very weary rider finally ascends Shockoe Hill in Richmond, and he finds Governor Jefferson. It's 8 o'clock in the morning, out in his garden, out by the townhouse where the governor lived at the time. And Jefferson looked at the message with the warning of 27 sail, and he said, well, we don't really know if this is the British. Maybe it's the Allied French fleet, which he'd been hoping would come. Or he said, perhaps it's a foraging party. 27 ships, but that's what he said. He said, perhaps it's a foraging party. And the main thing is that he had called out the militia before, and the militia did not like to be called out unnecessarily. So he was concerned that if he did, that there would be a backlash. He didn't want to do it unless he was certain. But the reality is, unimpeachable evidence in a time of war, at the time of the Revolution, was difficult to come by. So he did not want to assume the worst, but he wanted to take it cautiously. He sent some people out to get intelligence, see what more could be learned, to get definitive information. And there wasn't at the time, to him, to be fair, that this was the British. So this sets the stage for the story. Jefferson's in Richmond, 100 or so miles away. Arnold's fleet's there, and they are, in fact, going up the James River. Now, this part of the story, if you read biographies of Jefferson and Arnold, you might get a little bit of the story. But what struck me as I decided to work on this was, well, what was happening? Because if you read the histories, first of all, the first 2 days of the invasion, when Jefferson didn't know what was going on, are basically blank. It was not known what happened. There didn't seem to be records of what happened. So I was interested to see, as a reporter, could I find out something about what happened? So I put on my sort of investigative reporter cap, and I thought maybe I can figure out what happened by going through methodically who was on those 27 ships. So I found out here that the Navy Historical Society, just down the street at the Navy Yard, had some ship's logs, and I went there. And then I went further. They told me that you could get more ship's logs through the British National Archives. So I contacted them, and I obtained more ship's logs from the National Archives in London. And at that point, I made a list of the 27 ships and also the officers on those ships. And basically, to make a long story short, I cross-referenced the names of the officers on those ships with known journals by any officer who ever served for the British that I could determine. So matching these up, finally, I found a couple of journals that told me a little bit more about what happened. And in fact, there was one journal in particular by an officer named Bartholomew James, bless him. He basically wrote a journal that had very little about Virginia, except there were a couple of pages of very vivid description. He was on one of these ships. His journal was about other parts of history, so it was filed elsewhere. But he did give us the first insight that I know of what really happened in those first 2 days. And he told a rather amazing story. In those first 2 days, the British were attacking local citizens. They went ashore, and Arnold took 300 men and marched inland. And they started taking Virginians out of their beds. Any Virginian they saw, they were concerned would warn Jefferson and the people in Richmond that they were coming. So they took them out of their beds. In fact, he wrote that we, quote, took the principal inhabitants out of their beds amidst the deep cries of the family where they were staying. So while it was thought that maybe they just came up the James River, in fact, there were a lot of clashes going on. Local militia, who were thought to basically be scurrying away, in fact, were trying to meet them. Militia would come to the shoreline very poorly armed, and they would fire their muskets, or they had hatchets and swords. They clearly couldn't take on this enormous British fleet with all their cannons. So they did the best they could, and they tried to send more messages up. So 2 days later, Jefferson is still in Richmond wondering what's going on, and he writes, no intelligence. He still doesn't know what's happening, even though all these clashes are going on. So let me just give you one more example. And I've been doing this all from memory, so now I want to pick up where I've reminded myself what to say. So Jefferson is still unclear. It takes several days for Arnold to get up the James River. There's one crucial point, and I found this to be one of the most important things in writing this book, and that is there's a place called Hood's Point on the James River. It's about 25, 30 miles from Richmond, and it's a place where the James River, which is a big funnel at the coast, sort of narrows in, and there's a high point of land. And from the promontory, it was thought if you put a fort up there that you could shoot down, it's like a shooting gallery, and stop any advancing fleet. And it was the perfect location for a fort. A year earlier, Jefferson, to his credit, had said, let's build a fort there to make sure that we can stop an invading fleet. And 2 months earlier, he basically said, to the legislature, stop messing around. We really need this fort there. There was a shell of a fort. There were 90 militiamen, but there were no match for this fleet, no match whatsoever. And very easily, the fleet got past Hood Point. And at that point, the messengers who were there went to Richmond again and said, it's Benedict Arnold. There's a fleet of many ships. It's overwhelming. And at that point, Jefferson does call out as many militiamen as he can. But it's really too late to stop the initial invasion. The invasion basically gets all the way to Virginia, and Jefferson has to take flight from Richmond. In fact, one slave who remained in Richmond said that there wasn't a white person left in Richmond. So Jefferson, in fact, took his wife and their young children, and he may have saved their lives. He took them up the James River and put them at one house, and then he thought the British were coming, and he took them from that house and took them to another. And he rode around on horseback for several days while a lot of people were fleeing, and Jefferson himself was not in Richmond. In fact, he was ensuring the safety of his family and moving around papers and arms. So you can look at that and say that this was an amazing thing. He was not known for being a military person. He himself said that he had no military training and he wasn't leading a force in battle, but he didn't just run away. He did, in fact, stay there and take some very important action by hiding arms, hiding papers, taking care of his family, and remaining around the area. And he said during this entire time, he later wrote that during this entire time, he wasn't assisted by a single Virginian of the military, that he was on his own, on a horse, riding around, and he was a great horseman. So it gives you a little different picture of Thomas Jefferson than the Jefferson we know as a sort of perhaps quiet, shy man writing his Declaration. He was a very athletic man. He was a man who loved to ride his horse. He wasn't prepared to take on an army, but and he did wait too long to take action. But he didn't run away. He did stay around and try to make things as best as he could. One other discovery I want to mention in writing this, and that is, I mentioned that the journal of Bartholomew James, the British officer, was key in getting a little bit better picture of what happened during this invasion. There's one other diary in particular that I found to be absolutely essential, and it's a diary not by a British officer, but by a Hessian officer who assisted the British named Johann von Ewald. And the reason this is so important is that Ewald's diary was not actually found until after World War II, was not translated and published until the 1970s, and as far as I could tell, had not been used in histories of the invasion of Virginia, although it has been used in other histories of other actions during the Revolutionary War. And Ewald is right there by Benedict Arnold's side, and he sees things that just simply most people don't realize were going on. And so as a writer, I'm putting together pieces of the puzzle, and Ewald is a very, very important piece. And I look at his diary as one of the most important documents of the Revolutionary War, and I write in my acknowledgments that I hope, if I do nothing else, that I bring attention to things like the diary of Ewald. The book's out of print, but it is available in certain places and at libraries. So let me give you an example, just a quote from what Ewald wrote, to give you an example of Ewald's importance. Okay, at one point, Arnold wrote to his superiors, talking of the Battle of Richmond, that there was very little damage. Some things happened, but it wasn't that big a deal. Ewald, who was also there, wrote that the British, quote, ravaged and laid waste everything. Terrible things happened on this excursion. Churches and holy places were plundered. Half the place was in flames. It's a different picture than we've gotten of the invasion of Richmond. It's maybe the way we think of what happened in the Civil War in Richmond. I'm not saying it was as big as the Civil War. Obviously, it was not. But it gives you a better sense of what was actually going on in Richmond. All of the white people had fled. The British were there. There was a lot of plundering. They actually took Jefferson's slaves, who had remained behind from Jefferson's townhouse, and took them along as part of the British prisoner group. One other example, which I think is one of the most vivid examples, at one point Arnold wrote to his superiors that there were many loyalists in Virginia. And in fact, they were all happy and eager to see Benedict Arnold arrive. And 400 residents in Portsmouth, for example, took pledges of loyalty to the king, Arnold wrote. Ewald, who was also there, had a different perspective. He described the same scene this way. As the Virginians promised loyalty, many made, quote, wry faces as though they would choke on it. Time and again, you match up these different things. You see what Jefferson wrote, you see what Arnold wrote and other officers wrote, and Ewald comes along. And yes, he's fighting on the British side, but like a lot of British officers, he did not admire Arnold. He did not admire someone who was a traitor. They thought he could help him, but he really wasn't liked by either side. Jefferson called Arnold a parricide, one who murders his country, basically. His parent, parricide, and basically looked at him as someone who was such an evil person that Jefferson came up with two different plans to try to capture or kill Benedict Arnold, and I describe those plots in the book. So it gives you some sense about this dynamic of Arnold versus Jefferson, which is a big part of what I write about in this book. So this gives us, I think, a more compelling and a more complete story. And a lot of that is in places that, like this, the Library of Congress or other libraries where I did research, Society of the Cincinnati here in Washington. Certainly one of the most important things was also that I did a fellowship at the International Center for Jefferson Studies in Monticello. And one of the nice things about that is that not only could I go to the Jefferson Library and the University of Virginia Library there, I also got to walk in Jefferson's footsteps. And I thought as a writer that this was important. And if any of you have taken a vacation and thought to yourself, no, it takes a week or two to really slip away from the everyday world and get into this other world where you're vacationing, I wanted to try to do that so I could understand better Jefferson's world. So I was able to live in a little cottage just on a shoulder of the mountain down below Monticello. And there's a library there, but at night the librarians would go home, the staff would go home. There was a security person who would come around every now and then. But I really got a sense of what it was like to be in that mountain where Jefferson lived, in the mountain that he loved so dearly. And I thought I'd finally gotten to that point where I'm feeling the everyday world slip away when I was living in this cottage, and I basically didn't turn the TV on. I didn't read the daily paper, which for me is an enormous sacrifice because I usually spend 2 hours a day reading the newspaper. Instead, I read the 1780s Virginia Gazette to try to get into that mode. I listened to music that was composed by the people that Jefferson liked to listen to try to slip into that world a little bit. I got people at Monticello to take me on places on the map where Jefferson would have gone. I wanted to trace Jefferson's movements. And at one point I asked someone, can you take me from the riverbank on the exact path he would have walked up to Monticello? Because I want to describe this scene. And so this is an area not open to the public, but this person took me on the exact path. And it's the first sentence in the first chapter of the book that I describe. So I could accurately say it took about a half an hour to walk up and describe it. So I'm doing two things. I'm in libraries, but I'm also, because of the wonderful way Monticello has been preserved, Williamsburg has been preserved, I'm able to really put these pieces together. And one night, when I was at the cottage doing my research, there was an incredible storm. Literally, as they say, a dark and stormy night, one of the stormiest that I can remember. And as the windows are rattling and the thunder is coming down and the lightning all over the place, I remember there was a letter that Jefferson had wrote to a woman. This is later in his life. He wrote to a woman in Paris trying to entice her to come visit him in Virginia. And he described the scene and he said, "With what majesty do we ride there above the storms?" And I think it's one of the most lyrical things that Jefferson wrote in his lifetime. It's not the kind of thing that people know of, but I thought for about an hour I knew what he meant as all the thunder was coming on and the storms were going around. And then there's sometimes at Monticello that there's this unusual weather pattern where you're looking out and you're above all the clouds. There's sort of a white sea of clouds and you're above it all. And there's little ripples of mountains in the distance through the clouds. But again, this is what he thought. He thought this was a majestic place. So you can only imagine how much it would have hurt him to have to flee. The title of my book is Flight from Monticello, Thomas Jefferson at War. So this was a place he loved so dearly, and yet, as I write in the book, he fled just a couple of minutes before a British force reached Monticello, which he thought would be a secure place. And that's the rest of the story that I tell in the book. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you have, and thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious, in your research of original manuscripts, how do you decipher the handwriting? It's very complex when I look at a few.
This was a.
Could we repeat the questions, please?
Sure. The question is, how do I decipher the handwriting of a document written in the 1780s that A, may not be clear, B, may be water-stained, C, may have tears in it, and so on? It is a great challenge. And many times I would be sitting looking at a document. This happened numerous times where I thought this is important. First of all, a lot of documents have been transcribed. They're in the papers of Thomas Jefferson. But in doing this kind of research, I'm really trying to get another level of knowledge. And I tried very hard to use information not just from the, quote, great men of the time, but all sorts of average people. So there were a number of times where I looked at letters that had simply not been transcribed. So I did the best I could. I took digital images of the letters and I blew them up on the computer, which was basically the only way to read some of these letters. I would ask people what the letters meant because you don't want to misinterpret what someone wrote. And of course, some of the letters don't look the same as they do today. A lot of challenges there. I must tell you, numerous times I would do this, and then 2 months later, someone would say, oh, that's been transcribed in the 1910 edition of the Virginia History and Biography magazine. So at a certain point, I tried to find out, has someone somewhere transcribed this document? It's a little hard to do. In fact, one of the things after I finished the book, the papers of Thomas Jefferson are available in books. You can get them here at the Library of Congress and elsewhere. But very recently, they've also put digital editions of those books. You can now search by keyword, which is very important. The reason this is so important is because obviously I'm looking at a certain time period, so I'm reading the letters from that time period. But some of the best information about that time period, Jefferson's writing 20, 30, even 40 years later. In fact, one of the things I write about in the book is that 6 days before Jefferson died, he's still trying to explain his actions during the invasion of Virginia to the son of a person who wrote a very critical book about him. 6 days before he died, he's still thinking about these events because his honor had been challenged. And while he never spoke publicly about the charges involving Sally Hemings, he wrote constantly about this. He just seemed obsessed with trying to clear his name. He talked to historians, he talked to biographers, and you can almost hear him reaching out over the centuries, trying to tell me, well, this is what actually happened. Go look at this letter. So I really wanted to make sure that I had every letter in which he had written about these events. So in some cases, these were just simply not available in the early volumes. And later, for example, when I was at the Jefferson Library at Monticello, people would point out, well, you might want to look at this volume and look at elsewhere and look at things that other people wrote. And a lot of things that I did amounted to looking at letters that other people wrote about the action, not letters that Jefferson wrote or people wrote to him, but other people at the time. And some of his best friends, in fact, were very critical about his actions. And in the book, I write about how if the battle had not been basically won at Yorktown some months after Jefferson fled Monticello, that very likely would not think of him the same way in history. We might think of him as this person who vacated the governorship, fled Monticello. Instead, he used those events. One of the things that I talk about at the end of the book, which I think is very important, I mentioned at the beginning, what's the lesson? So let me use this opportunity to tell you what I think one of the lessons is from this that he learned. Some people have said, in fact, that this was such a difficult moment in his life. He, in fact, said the events of the invasion of Virginia and the efforts to censure his conduct by the legislature inflicted a wound upon his soul that would only be cured by the, quote, all-healing grave. This was a man who was really, really upset by these actions and thought that people did not understand him, thought that he was being attacked as a coward unfairly. Clearly, that bothered him tremendously. So what did he learn from this? What I write at the end is that I think that he eventually learned that there are times that you do have to take more strong action as an executive. He did not believe in a strong chief executive role. He was concerned it would be tyrannical. But eventually he wrote to a subsequent governor of Virginia that there's times the executive does have to take strong action, for example, during an invasion. Obviously, that would be a good time to take action strongly, right? And when he ran for president, my impression is that he did so in part because he was concerned that the Federalists, who believed in a very strong central government, strong national army, he was concerned they would go unnecessarily to war against a great European power and that the young United States would not be prepared for a second war so soon. So as I read his letters, I see him saying, as he wrote once, one war is enough for one man. He was concerned that others, if they were president, would possibly destroy the country by going to a war that the country wasn't prepared for. So he decided to run for president. And I think that's one of the reasons he did so, that he thought he was uniquely qualified to understand the dangers of what could happen. So although he himself didn't believe in a strong executive, he became president of the United States and served 2 terms. And one of the things that struck me, and that he's probably not that well known for, is that he signed legislation that created the Military Training Academy at West Point. West Point existed, obviously, before then, but he said, let's train officers, and he also said, let's have better engineering of forts and canals. I told you the story earlier of how the Virginia militia had to run when the British came up James River, and Hood's Point, the fort there, could not fire back. And I think he learned that lesson, and that's why he thought West Point should be a training facility and an engineering facility that would have a strong defensive system so that another invader could not come and attack the United States. Yes. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Well, that was actually my question. I read a bit about the revolutionary history, and my understanding was that the colonists did not financially support any kind of strong militia or army, where the Federalists from the North were always upset with them because even George Washington did not get the support militarily that he needed in order to fight successfully against much bigger armies. So how much, other than the West Point, how much did he actually invest in creating some sort of defensive forces for the United States?
Well, the question is, how much did Jefferson invest in defensive forces? I believe you're talking about when he was president. Is that right? When he was president.
Before he was president, he was
Yeah.
very much against.
This was his concern. He did he did support a national force, but he was very concerned about the power of a standing army. He'd seen what happened elsewhere in other countries, and he was concerned if the army had too much power, that it could take control and it would basically run things. So he was concerned about that. When he did create the West Point Military Academy, he also wanted to make sure that officers that were in line with his thinking would be in power. So that was also very important to his way of thinking. He did say that if we're at war, that he would make sure that we fought like men, he said. And he did send, for example, the Navy against the pirates in the Barbary States. So he did do a couple of things militarily, but he really wanted to keep us out of war. He did a lot of things. He went to great lengths, and he was criticized to some degree for doing so. He imposed embargoes, he did treaties, he did a number of things to try to avoid a military conflict that he thought the United States could not enter into. Of course, later there was the War of 1812. He was no longer president. But you have to look back and say during those 2 terms that he was successful in that way. You can criticize the embargoes, things like that, as some do, but that there was not a major conflagration with another European power. So he was successful in that regard. If I can you asked a question about what he did as president on the national force. It was also striking in writing this book that there were a lot of concerns in Virginia about were the other states contributing to help Virginia. When the invasion of Virginia happened, there was basically one Continental Army officer in Virginia, and Virginia had sent a lot of officers to serve in the Continental Army. And Jefferson was writing George Washington basically saying, we've helped you, now you need to help us. And Washington, of course, is writing back saying, we've got our own problems. And I trust in the confidence and the courage of Virginians that they can defend Virginia. Of course, he's a Virginian himself. So Jefferson did believe that the militia, a well-regulated militia, could defend the state, but they just were not equipped to do so. The one thing that the militia in Virginia did do, and I don't think it was by design, but it worked out, was that as Jefferson is fleeing, legislators are fleeing, militia is fleeing, the British are following them. They're running all over Virginia, and basically they were spreading themselves too thin. So there was no major battlefield defeat in Virginia, unlike what we think of, for example, in South Carolina and elsewhere. In Virginia, it was a lot of small skirmishes. And in the end, you can look back and say, if someone thought of this plan, they were pretty smart because it basically forced the British to spread too thin, and then they decided to regroup at a place called Yorktown, where, of course, they were bottled up and defeated. So not by design, but it did work out. And at that Battle of Yorktown, there were a lot of Virginia militia that played an important role in defeating the British. Yes, sir.
2 quick questions. Why didn't the British burn Monticello? And I'd heard that some of the British Saratoga prisoners eventually ended up in Charlottesville. What do you know about that?
Yes, the question is, I'll take 2 questions, and you can remind me of the second one if I forget, but chronologically, the first question is, what happened to the prisoners of Saratoga, 4,000 or so British and Hessian prisoners who were taken prisoner, and in fact, they were taken to Boston. And the people in Boston eventually said, if they stay here, the British are going to come, try to free them, and we'll all be in danger. And this sounds very familiar to me as a political reporter here in Washington. Thomas Jefferson basically said, we've got room. We could take the federal money and put them in a prison by Charlottesville. And we need some craftsmen. And if you'd bring those prisoners down here, we'll put them up at the Albemarle Barracks and we'll build them prison camps. And they'll all be secure, and no British will ever want to come to Charlottesville. They just never make it here. So in the book, as you might imagine, this is a fairly dramatic point of the book. I write several chapters about this coming of the prisoners to Charlottesville. And at one point, there are people saying to Jefferson and to the then governor of Virginia, Patrick Henry, saying, this makes no sense. We can't get supplies to these people. But Jefferson writes back and says, no, this is a great idea. We can use their services and we can use the federal funds. And he's able to convince the government to basically bring them all the way to Charlottesville. There's one thing that he likes also about the fact that these prisoners are coming to Charlottesville. This is a man who believed that there was honor among officers. And he made sure that the British and Hessian top officers were given very, very nice accommodations at mansions near Monticello. So there's a British officer just down the road. There's a Hessian officer just down the road. Not only that, but Jefferson is delighted to find that some of these officers are very talented violinists. And Jefferson's been searching for some talented musicians. He's complained often about the talent of musicians in Virginia. And Jefferson believes, and this is what he wrote, that music is the passion of my soul. He practiced sometimes for 3 hours a day. The Revolution did interrupt that. But he really loved to listen to Italian sonatas, Corelli, Bonporti. So he would listen to music, and then he would play music with his wife, Martha, who accompanied him. And he brought over the British officers to play at the parlor in Monticello, never imagining some of these same officers would later be involved in the invasion of Virginia. So I thought it was a remarkable point. He never thought they would come to Charlottesville. In fact, they certainly did come to Charlottesville, and they had to flee. Now, I think the second question you had is why, when the British came to Monticello, did they not burn Monticello? No one of the British side writes exactly that, but Jefferson does talk about this. The British had gone around, and in fact, the British did destroy another Jefferson home. And this is a much lesser known story, but I do write about it in the book. A plantation called Elk Hill. The British come and they take the plantation and they basically destroy a lot of the plantation. And Jefferson's very upset about that. Lord Cornwallis is there with his army. And someone writes at the time that it's like this horde, and they come over and they strip everything from the land. Animals are killed and everything's taken off the land. And Jefferson was very bitter that Cornwallis did that. In fact, Cornwallis wrote one letter, and the address is Jefferson's camp. He's talking about writing from Jefferson's home at Elk Hill, which I think is about 29 miles from Monticello. And the reference here is that there's another British force that comes to Monticello, and the officer raids Charlottesville with a legislators meeting to try to call out the militia, and he sends some officers up to Monticello to see if Jefferson is there. And Jefferson, in fact, is there, and there is a very dramatic moment where a Virginian learns that the British might go to Monticello, and he warns Jefferson to leave. And Jefferson putters around. He doesn't quite leave. He thinks he has time. He can see everything from Monticello. He writes at one point that I could see 10 or 12 counties from the mountain adjoining Monticello. And he wants to get the papers. He sends his wife and children away. But he himself stays there longer. And then another Virginian learns that Jefferson may not have left. And he races to Monticello and says, Governor Jefferson, you have to leave. The British are almost here. And so Jefferson looks around. He still doesn't think he has to leave. But finally, he gets all his papers. And he writes that in my flight, I stuffed in papers where I could. So Jefferson himself used the word flight, which is the word that I use in the title of my book, Flight from Monticello. The British arrived and they did not find Jefferson. They did find wine in the cellar and they took advantage of that. Then they left. They basically didn't have much time. I don't know if they were instructed not to disturb Monticello or not. Perhaps, and I don't know this for sure, I don't think anyone can say, the British had heard how well Jefferson had treated those prisoners who were at the barracks a couple of years earlier. And maybe the British felt they treated us well. In return, let's not destroy Monticello. So Jefferson was very grateful, and he spoke actually very well of Banastre Tarleton, who's very ill thought of in history, but he thanked Tarleton for not destroying Monticello. Yes, sir.
Washington retreats out of Boston, and he retreats out of New York, and he was quite criticized by contemporaries for doing that. So I don't know, is one of the lessons learned just don't pay any heed to irrational critics?
Well, the question is, don't a lot of generals, George Washington, others flee when they need to flee? Of course, retreat is always a good strategy if you're going to get taken prisoner and possibly sent over to London. So it's logical. In fact, at one point, I found a letter by Thomas Paine in which he writes in a Boston newspaper that Jefferson should not be criticized for taking flight. He said basically the legislature is wherever it decides to meet. If it meets in a building, the legislature is there. If it meets in an open field, that's where the legislature meets. It doesn't make any difference as long as they're not caught. And this was a strong defense. And if you're going to be caught, Jefferson would be the first to say, why hang around? Jefferson was called a coward by some of his critics, especially when he ran for the presidency. And he said, why should I try to fight singly against a troop? And I think that is a very valid point. There's no reason to stay if you're going to be caught. What good would it do if the person who had been governor of the most important and powerful state in the country, as well as being the author of Declaration of Independence, is caught by the British? It would serve no purpose. So the people who said he was a coward for leaving Monticello, that in and of itself may not be a valid criticism. More valid is the criticism of why a couple days earlier he decided not to continue as governor. His second one-year term had expired just before the British arrived, and Jefferson said that he was not equipped militarily in his training to operate Virginia military at this time. And he wanted another officer, perhaps Thomas Nelson, who did subsequently become governor, to run the state. Earlier, Jefferson had thought it would not be a good idea to have a political and military person be the governor. But at this crucial moment, he said, there are others more qualified than me, and I really need to turn over the reins to somebody else. And he vacated the governorship. So you can say that makes sense. The problem is that Virginia had no leadership at one of its darkest hours. The legislature itself had fled over the Blue Ridge to Stanton, and it was meeting and trying to decide what to do. And that's where some legislators said, we should launch an investigation into Jefferson's conduct. And they did. There was a letter sent to Jefferson in which they said, please explain to us why you did these things. And Jefferson spent weeks and weeks agonizing over this, trying to come up with a defense of why he did what he did. And he wrote this long defense. And by the time he got to present it to the legislature, the victory at Yorktown had already occurred. And the legislature said, thank you very much. We've basically won the war. You're exonerated. Jefferson was so anxious to give his defense that he basically stood up in the legislature and said, well, I'm going to question myself and give you the answers. And being a lawyer, that's what he did. He gave the best defense that he could. And he felt that he really wanted to try to exonerate himself. And fortunately for him, the battle at Yorktown did result in a peace treaty a couple of years later, and he was then sent to Paris as an ambassador and then later became president. So he was able to do things later on that in the balance of history we remember him for. But this is the event, as I write, that I think shaped those years. Yes, sir.
If you know, did any signer of the Declaration of Independence ever become a prisoner of the British? And then the other thing I wondered was, did Jefferson consult with, say, Monroe or Madison, as he usually did on things, about his defense in front of the Legislative Assembly?
He did write to Madison. The question is, was there a signer of the Declaration who became prisoner of the British? That was one question. There's one gentleman I'm thinking of, and I don't want to say now because I can't remember if he signed the Declaration or not, but there was a gentleman from South Carolina who was taken prisoner and was in the Tower of London. And off the top of my head, I can't remember if he was a signer or not, but that's the one person I'm thinking of. Lawrence, exactly. Thank you. And so that's one example. But, so there would be reason to be concerned that if the British caught you, that you would be taken prisoner, sent to the Tower of London. Who knew what would happen? I mean, Jefferson, one of the radical things he did long before he wrote the Declaration of Independence was that he wrote a document called A Summary of the Rights of British America. And this was about 1774. And this was the precursor to the Declaration. At the time he did this, he would have known that this, was a crime against Britain and that he could be hanged for this. And yet he believed so strongly that he went ahead and wrote this document. And it really did, at the time, he was more radical than a lot of other Virginians in that respect. And I'm sorry, what was your second question?
Whether or not Madison or Monroe consulted with him on the defense before the Legislative Assembly.
My recollection is that he did talk with Madison. I don't recall Monroe. But he did, there was another point at which they wanted him to serve in the legislature after he'd already given his defense. And he wrote, I think it was to Madison, but to one of the other legislators, that he could not do so. He was concerned about his wife's health, and he really wanted to retreat to Monticello. He did not see himself at that time as returning to political life. Some people thought that he would be that he was qualified to do so, but he'd been through so much, he just did not want to return to the legislature at that time. How much more time do we have?
5 more minutes.
All right. Yes, sir.
Hi, I apologize if I didn't hear it earlier, but I'm also new to American history. So I'm always a what-if person. What if Jefferson had called out the militia at the moment he had heard of the people on the shore wanting to turn up?
The question is, what if Jefferson had fully called out the militia when the British showed up, if he had known more? It's hard. It's a little hard to say. One of Jefferson's greatest critics was a person named Light Horse Harry Lee, who later wrote a book about Jefferson. Basically, it was an autobiography, but a lot of the book today is known as being a great critique of Jefferson's actions. And Lee, who was a great cavalry officer, wrote that if he had been in charge of Virginia's forces, that he would certainly have called out enough militia and could have easily defeated the British. This was Lee's opinion. Jefferson didn't agree. There's really no way to know, what would have happened exactly. The problem is that the militia was not armed enough. I mean, the statute called for a well-armed, well-regulated militia, and it just wasn't. So even if he called out all these men, I don't know if they could have beaten back all of the great arms, the cannons and the ships and so forth of the British. The British came in and they easily destroyed what was left of the Virginia Navy. They really had their way. When Arnold was in Virginia, he didn't stay throughout the entire invasion, but several months he was there. He basically had his way. Wherever he wanted to go, he did so at ease. In fact, the British officers in New York were sort of stunned because there had been two previous brief British forays into Virginia, and they both had been very, very short. And they marveled that Arnold could go so easily all the way to Richmond, leave, go wherever he wanted. So I don't know if, it's just a question that we'll never know for sure.
It's more of a betting question.
Sorry?
It's more of a betting question, I suppose. We'll never know.
Never will know exactly.
Time for one more question.
Yes, in the back?
Did your research give you any new insight into Benedict Arnold's motives for changing sides?
The question is, why did Benedict Arnold change sides? Did this tell more about his motives? I do think that my research gives you a whole nother aspect of Benedict Arnold. I've read a number of biographies. Sometimes this is passed over in a few pages, sometimes more. What I was able to do is go and look at a lot of records that are sometimes mentioned, but Arnold during this invasion had a great feud with another British commander that was on this mission, and they argued over plunder and what to take as prizes. And there are letters and documents that show that there was actually legal action later over whether Arnold could get this money or that money. And at one point, a British officer wrote, this is a British officer who liked Arnold, thought he was a great military leader, concluded that Arnold's motivation is money. So basically came to the same conclusion that a lot of Americans did. So both sides eventually came to that conclusion about Benedict Arnold. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.